Few people notice the quiet person in the room until they say the one thing nobody expected. The annual Global Heritage Gala at the Hawthorne Grand Hotel was supposed to celebrate business partnerships from around the world, but the only thing anyone would remember was the moment a billionaire stood up and walked away. Adrian al-Rashid was not simply another wealthy guest. He was the white Arab billionaire CEO of an international investment company with offices across 3 continents, and his reputation arrived long before he did. Hotel managers checked every detail twice. Event planners whispered instructions through tiny headsets. Even experienced servers lowered their voices when they heard his name. People said he demanded excellence because his family had built everything from nothing. Other people simply called him impossible to please. Jasmine Brooks had heard every story during her shift meeting. The 27-year-old black waitress tied her apron, smoothed the front of her uniform, and listened while the restaurant manager pointed toward the private dining room. Table 7 belongs to Mr. Al-Rashid and his guests. Stay professional. Be polite. Let the supervisors handle any problems. Jasmine smiled softly. I understand. Her grandmother had raised her to believe that every customer deserved respect, whether they ordered a cup of coffee or owned half the city. The ballroom sparkled beneath crystal chandeliers. Soft music drifted through the air while guests admired paintings and floral displays brought in for the evening. Business leaders laughed over dinner. Reporters waited near the entrance. Everything seemed perfect until one of the international guests began speaking to Adrian in Arabic. The older gentleman looked worried. He searched for the right words, paused, and tried again. Adrian answered politely at first, but the conversation became tense. Several people at the table looked confused. An interpreter hurried over, listened for a moment, and quietly admitted that he could not understand the older man's regional accent. The gentleman looked embarrassed. Adrian rubbed his forehead and stood from his chair. Forget it, he said in English. There is no point continuing. The ballroom suddenly felt smaller. Nobody moved. The older guest lowered his eyes. Adrian thanked his hosts with a brief nod and started walking toward the exit. Managers exchanged nervous looks. Sponsors whispered to one another. Months of planning seemed ready to fall apart because of one misunderstanding. Jasmine was carrying a tray of teacups when she noticed the older gentleman sitting alone. His hands trembled slightly as he folded a small piece of paper and placed it in his pocket. She looked toward Adrian, who was already halfway across the ballroom. Then she looked back at the guest. Her grandmother had once told her that language was more than words. Sometimes it was the only bridge between 2 lonely people. Jasmine set down the tray. She took one careful step forward and spoke in calm, clear Arabic. Sir, please do not leave. He was only trying to honor your family tradition. The older gentleman looked up in surprise. Adrian stopped walking. Every conversation in the ballroom faded into silence. The billionaire slowly turned around. His expression changed from frustration to complete disbelief. Jasmine stood quietly in her simple apron beneath the bright ballroom lights, and before anyone could understand what had happened, she spoke another perfect sentence in Arabic. Adrian stared at her for a long moment and asked a question that made every person in the room hold their breath. Jasmine could feel hundreds of eyes on her, but she kept her hands folded neatly in front of her apron and waited. The ballroom had become so quiet that the soft music from the string quartet sounded strangely loud. Adrian al-Rashid slowly walked back across the polished marble floor until he stood only a few feet away from her. The older gentleman who had started the misunderstanding looked from one face to the other with complete surprise. Adrian spoke first, choosing Arabic instead of English. His voice was calm now, but there was curiosity behind every word. Where did you learn to speak like that? Jasmine understood the question immediately, yet she did not answer right away. She looked toward the older guest instead. In gentle Arabic, she explained that Adrian had only wanted to show respect for a family tradition and that the confusion had come from different regional expressions, not from a lack of appreciation. The older man listened carefully. Then a slow smile spread across his face. He laughed softly and answered Jasmine with a long sentence that made several guests look at one another in confusion. Jasmine laughed too. Adrian stood perfectly still. When the conversation ended, the older gentleman reached out and shook Adrian's hand warmly. Whatever misunderstanding had existed was gone. The ballroom seemed to breathe again. People returned to their seats. Managers quietly thanked one another. Adrian looked back at Jasmine. You did not answer my question. Jasmine smiled politely. I only wanted to help your guest feel welcome. Adrian folded his arms. You avoided the question very well. A few guests smiled, expecting the waitress to become nervous. Instead, Jasmine simply nodded. My grandmother says that some conversations should begin with kindness before curiosity. Adrian looked at her for a moment and then laughed quietly. It was not a loud laugh, but it surprised everyone who heard it. One of the hotel managers nearly dropped a stack of menus. Adrian pulled out a chair for the older gentleman and sat down again. Then perhaps we should start over. Jasmine poured fresh tea for both men. Adrian watched her carefully. She moved with confidence, but never with pride. Every cup was placed exactly where it belonged. Every guest received the same attention. Finally, Adrian spoke again, this time in Arabic. He chose a traditional greeting that many younger speakers rarely used. Jasmine answered naturally without pausing to think. The older gentleman smiled with approval. Adrian tried another expression, one connected to old poetry. Jasmine answered that as well. A business executive sitting nearby whispered to another guest, she cannot possibly know all of this. Adrian heard him and looked back at Jasmine. Did you study in the Middle East? Jasmine shook her head. No, sir. Did you attend a language academy? No, sir. Do you work as an interpreter during the day? Jasmine smiled again. No, sir. Adrian leaned back in his chair. The mystery only seemed to grow larger. He looked at the older gentleman, who quietly nodded with obvious admiration. Then Adrian turned to Jasmine one more time and asked a question in Arabic that sounded almost impossible for an ordinary conversation. Several guests waited for her to hesitate. Instead, Jasmine answered with such warmth and perfect rhythm that the older gentleman placed his hand over his heart. Adrian did not say a word. He simply stared at the young waitress standing beneath the ballroom lights and realized that the simplest person in the room might be carrying the most extraordinary story. Jasmine could feel the surprise spreading across the ballroom faster than any conversation. Guests who had been discussing business deals only minutes before were now watching a young black waitress and a billionaire CEO exchange Arabic expressions as naturally as old friends. She quietly picked up the tea tray, expecting the moment to end, but Adrian al-Rashid was not finished. Miss, he said in English, would you join us for one more minute? The hotel manager looked nervous. Waitresses were not supposed to become part of the evening's entertainment. Jasmine glanced toward her supervisor, who gave a small, uncertain nod. She returned to the table. Adrian stood and pulled out a chair. Please sit. Jasmine smiled politely and shook her head. Thank you, sir, but I should continue working. The older gentleman laughed warmly and spoke in Arabic. Jasmine translated for the table. He says that a guest should never leave gratitude standing. Several people smiled at the answer. Adrian gestured toward an empty chair once more. Then give us 5 minutes. Jasmine finally sat down, still wearing her simple apron while surrounded by expensive suits and elegant evening gowns. Adrian studied her with honest curiosity. You understand different regional accents. You know traditional greetings. You even answered an old poetic expression correctly. That is unusual. Jasmine folded her hands. Languages have always interested me. Adrian smiled slightly. That answer explains nothing. The older gentleman nodded in agreement. Adrian switched back to Arabic. This time his words came slowly. He recited an old saying about travelers and kindness, one his grandfather had taught him as a child. Before he could finish, Jasmine completed the final line with perfect pronunciation. The older gentleman laughed with delight and gently tapped the table. Adrian blinked in surprise. Very few people outside my family know that saying. Jasmine looked down at the teacup in front of her. Someone important shared it with me a long time ago. Adrian leaned forward. A teacher? Jasmine smiled. You could call him that. Was he from my country? Jasmine hesitated for the first time all evening. Yes, sir. Adrian looked genuinely interested now. The ballroom around them seemed to disappear. Reporters stopped taking notes. Guests lowered their voices. Even the musicians played more softly. Adrian asked another question. Did he teach you the language? Jasmine nodded. And much more than that. The older gentleman asked something gentle in Arabic. Jasmine listened and answered quietly. His expression softened. Adrian looked from one to the other. What did he ask? Jasmine smiled. He asked if I still remember the stories. Adrian frowned slightly. Stories. Jasmine nodded. He believed that a language was not only grammar. It was history, family, kindness, and the promises people make to one another. The older gentleman placed his hand over his heart again. Adrian looked thoughtful. Who was this man? Jasmine opened her mouth to answer, but a young server hurried toward the table carrying a silver envelope. Mr. Al-Rashid, this was just delivered for you. Adrian thanked him and opened the envelope. Inside was an old photograph that had somehow become mixed with the evening's documents. He glanced at it casually, then froze. His eyes moved from the picture to Jasmine and back again. The older gentleman leaned over and looked at the photograph too. His smile disappeared. Adrian slowly stood from his chair, holding the faded picture and shaking hands, and asked Jasmine one quiet question in Arabic. How do you know the man standing beside my father? Jasmine looked at the old photograph and felt her heart skip for a moment. The ballroom around her seemed to disappear beneath the soft music and quiet conversations. Adrian Al-Rashid was still holding the faded picture in his hands, waiting for an answer. The older gentleman beside him leaned forward, studying Jasmine's face with growing curiosity. Jasmine looked at the photograph again. A younger version of Adrian's father stood beside a smiling man in a simple work shirt. Between them was a little market stall covered with books and handmade crafts. Jasmine smiled softly. I know him because he changed my life. Adrian lowered the photograph slightly. You knew my father? Jasmine shook her head. Not your father. The man standing beside him. Adrian looked back at the picture. His name was Hassan. Jasmine nodded. Yes, sir. The older gentleman smiled with recognition. Hassan was one of the kindest people I ever met. Jasmine looked down at the photograph. I was 9 years old when I met him. Adrian quietly pulled out the empty chair again. This time Jasmine accepted. Guests nearby tried not to listen, but nobody could ignore the conversation anymore. Adrian asked gently, what happened? Jasmine folded her hands. My grandmother and I lived near a small international market after my parents passed away. She worked long hours, and after school I would help local shop owners clean up. One afternoon I met a man who sold old books and gifts from around the world. His name was Hassan. The older gentleman nodded with a smile. That sounds exactly like him. Jasmine continued. He noticed that I liked to read. One day he asked if I wanted to learn a new word. I said yes. The next day he taught me another. After a few weeks, he was teaching me simple Arabic greetings. Adrian listened without interrupting. Jasmine smiled at the memory. He told me that every language opened a new window into another person's heart. He never accepted money for the lessons. He only asked me to practice every day. Adrian looked at the photograph. My father often visited Hassan's market when he came to America for business. They became close friends. Jasmine nodded. I remember. Your father would bring books for the children. Sometimes he would sit and drink tea while Hassan told stories. Adrian looked surprised. You remember my father? Jasmine smiled. I was just a little girl, but I remember a kind man who always greeted everyone before talking about business. The older gentleman laughed softly. That sounds like his father. Adrian looked thoughtful. Hassan never mentioned teaching a young girl Arabic. Jasmine's smile faded just a little. He said kindness should not become a headline. He believed the best gifts were the ones people discovered years later. A waiter quietly refilled the tea cups while the conversation continued. The ballroom had returned to its normal rhythm, but Adrian hardly noticed. He looked at Jasmine and asked, How long did he teach you? Jasmine glanced at the old photograph one more time. Until the day his little market closed. Before we said goodbye, he gave me a small notebook filled with stories, poems, and sayings from his family. He told me to protect them because traditions only survive when someone remembers them. Adrian slowly folded the photograph and placed it back inside the envelope. Then he looked at Jasmine with quiet disbelief. That notebook belonged to my grandfather before he gave it to Hassan. There was only one copy in our family, and nobody has seen it in more than 20 years. Jasmine looked at Adrian for a long moment before answering. The ballroom lights reflected against the polished tables, and the soft music had returned, but their corner of the room seemed untouched by the noise around them. Adrian's words stayed in the air between them. There was only one notebook in his family. It had disappeared more than 20 years ago. Jasmine folded her hands in her lap. I still have it, she said quietly. Adrian blinked in surprise. The older gentleman beside him smiled as though he had been waiting for that answer all along. Adrian leaned forward. You still have my grandfather's notebook? Jasmine nodded. It stays on a shelf in my apartment beside my grandmother's favorite books. Adrian looked amazed. You kept it all this time? Jasmine smiled. Hassan told me that some gifts should never be measured by money. He said they become part of the person who receives them. The older gentleman laughed softly and spoke in Arabic. Jasmine translated. He says Hassan always believed that wisdom traveled farther than wealth. Adrian looked down at the photograph resting beside his teacup. My grandfather filled that notebook with old family stories and sayings. When he gave it to Hassan, he told him to share them with people who would appreciate them. Jasmine nodded. Hassan did exactly that. Before Adrian could ask another question, a small commotion near the entrance drew everyone's attention. An elderly couple had arrived late to the gala. The gentleman looked worried while his wife searched through her purse for an invitation card. The hotel staff tried to help, but the couple spoke very little English. Several employees looked uncertain about what to do. Jasmine quietly stood from the table. Excuse me for a moment. Adrian watched as she walked toward the entrance. The elderly couple smiled with relief when Jasmine greeted them in Arabic. She listened carefully, nodded, and spoke gently. The older woman laughed, and her husband relaxed immediately. Jasmine guided them toward their table, explained the evening's schedule, and made sure they were comfortable before returning to work. Adrian had watched the entire exchange without saying a word. You could have stayed here, he said when Jasmine returned. Nobody would have blamed you. Jasmine smiled. They looked nervous. Adrian nodded toward the entrance. You could have impressed everyone at this table instead. Jasmine looked genuinely confused. Why would I do that when they needed help? The older gentleman laughed again and tapped the table with a smile. Adrian looked at Jasmine for a long moment. Most people would have used a talent like yours to attract attention. Jasmine shook her head. Hassan taught me that a language is supposed to make other people feel at home. If it only makes you look important, then you missed the lesson. Adrian looked away for a second and quietly smiled to himself. The ballroom applause began as the elderly couple reached their seats. They looked back toward Jasmine and waved with gratitude. Jasmine waved back and picked up her tea tray. Adrian stood. Miss Brooks. Jasmine stopped. Yes, sir. Adrian held up the old photograph. You have answered every question I asked tonight, but there is one I cannot stop thinking about. Jasmine waited patiently. Adrian's voice became softer than it had been all evening. If you still have that notebook, then why did you never try to sell it or use it to open doors for yourself? Jasmine looked at the photograph, then at the older gentleman, and finally at Adrian. A gentle smile crossed her face. Because the man who gave it to me already opened the most important door of all, and I promised him I would never forget why. Jasmine's answer stayed with Adrian long after she returned to her work. The ballroom was alive with conversation again, but he found himself watching the young waitress as she moved from table to table with the same quiet kindness she had shown since the evening began. She greeted every guest with the same warm smile. She made sure older visitors had comfortable seats. She noticed empty water glasses before anyone asked. The older gentleman beside Adrian folded his hands and spoke softly in Arabic. Jasmine translated from across the room without missing a step. The old man smiled with approval. Adrian looked at him with curiosity. What did you say? The older gentleman laughed. I asked if she still remembered the first story Hassan ever taught her. Adrian looked toward Jasmine. She had heard the question. Instead of answering immediately, she finished serving a family at a nearby table and then walked back with a fresh pot of tea. She poured a cup for the older gentleman before speaking. The first story was about a traveler who lost his way in the desert. The older gentleman nodded happily. Do you remember the lesson? Jasmine smiled. The traveler believed he was searching for treasure, but he discovered that the people who welcomed him into their homes were the real gift. Adrian looked thoughtful. My grandfather used to tell that story to me. Jasmine nodded. Hassan said your grandfather would always stop before the ending and ask children what they thought the treasure should be. The older gentleman laughed so hard that tears filled his eyes. She remembers every detail. Adrian could hardly believe it. He looked at Jasmine and asked, Do you still have the notebook with you? Jasmine shook her head. No, sir. It stays safely at home. Adrian smiled. That is probably wise. Before the conversation could continue, a hotel employee hurried into the ballroom looking worried. A small group of international guests had arrived unexpectedly for the event, and several of them spoke only Arabic. The hotel staff tried to welcome them, but confusion quickly spread. One guest looked uncertain about where to sit. Another was trying to ask about a dietary request. The managers exchanged nervous glances. Jasmine quietly set down her tray and walked toward the entrance. Adrian watched without saying a word. Jasmine greeted each guest warmly in Arabic. She introduced them to the staff, answered their questions, and even shared a light-hearted joke that made the entire group laugh. Within minutes, the uncertainty disappeared. The guests thanked her with grateful smiles and followed the staff to their tables. Adrian noticed something unexpected. Jasmine never mentioned that she could speak the language fluently. She never drew attention to herself. She simply helped and walked away. The older gentleman looked at Adrian. Hassan chose well. Adrian nodded slowly. I think he did. A few moments later, Jasmine returned to her duties as though nothing unusual had happened. Adrian stood and walked toward her. Miss Brooks. Jasmine turned with her usual calm smile. Yes, sir. Adrian looked around the ballroom at the guests she had just helped. Tonight I came here expecting to discuss investments and business opportunities. Jasmine waited quietly. Adrian smiled for the first time that evening without hesitation. Instead, I think I have spent the night discovering a part of my own family's history that I did not know was still alive. Jasmine looked down for a moment and then reached into the pocket of her apron. She pulled out a small folded piece of paper and held it carefully in her hand. If that is true, sir, then there is something Hassan asked me to give your family if we ever met again. Jasmine carefully unfolded the small piece of paper she had carried in the pocket of her apron for years. Adrian and the older gentleman stood quietly in front of her while the ballroom carried on around them. The paper was worn along the edges, folded and unfolded so many times that the corners had become soft. Jasmine held it with both hands as though it were something precious. Hassan gave this to me the last time I saw him, she said. Adrian looked at the paper and then at Jasmine. He asked you to keep it? Jasmine nodded. He told me that one day I might meet someone from your family. If that happened, he wanted me to read these words out loud before giving them away. The older gentleman smiled gently and motioned for her to continue. Jasmine took a slow breath and began reading in Arabic. Her voice was calm and steady. The language flowed through the ballroom with a quiet beauty that made nearby conversations fade away. Adrian listened carefully. At first his expression was thoughtful. Then surprise crossed his face. Finally, he lowered his eyes as though he had recognized something deeply familiar. When Jasmine finished, the older gentleman quietly placed his hand over his heart. Adrian looked at her. That was my grandfather's favorite blessing. Jasmine smiled. Hassan said your grandfather would say it whenever someone showed kindness without expecting anything in return. Adrian asked softly, Did Hassan tell you what it meant? Jasmine nodded and translated into English. May the doors you open for others become the path that guides you home. Adrian stood silent for a moment. Then he laughed quietly and shook his head. I have heard business speeches in a dozen countries, and somehow a waitress carrying a tea tray reminds me of my grandfather better than any of them. Jasmine smiled but said nothing. The older gentleman looked at Adrian and spoke in Arabic. Adrian listened carefully before answering. Jasmine waited. Adrian turned toward her. He says Hassan talked about you often. Jasmine blinked in surprise. About me? The older gentleman nodded. Adrian translated for him. Hassan said there was a little girl who never forgot a lesson and who always asked for one more story before going home. He believed she would grow into someone who would help strangers feel welcome. Jasmine looked down at the folded paper in her hands. I did not know he remembered me that way. Adrian smiled warmly. I think he remembered you exactly that way. A photographer approached the group and politely asked Adrian for a picture with several international guests. Adrian thanked him but asked for a few more minutes. Jasmine noticed something different about him now. The frustration from earlier in the evening had disappeared completely. He looked more like a son remembering old family stories than a billionaire attending an important event. Adrian looked at the folded paper again. Did Hassan ever ask for anything in return for all the time he spent teaching you? Jasmine smiled and laughed softly. Only one thing. Adrian raised an eyebrow. What was that? Jasmine looked across the ballroom where the elderly couple she had helped earlier were smiling and enjoying their dinner. He told me that if I ever met someone who felt far from home, I should make sure they never felt alone. The older gentleman's eyes filled with tears. Adrian looked around the ballroom at the families, the guests, and the friends sharing conversations beneath the lights. Then he looked back at Jasmine. I think Hassan would be very proud tonight. Jasmine carefully folded the paper one last time and held it out to Adrian. He also told me that when the right day came, I should return this to the family because some treasures are meant to travel home. Jasmine held out the folded paper, but Adrian did not take it right away. He looked at the small piece of worn stationery as though it carried the voices of people he had loved and missed for many years. The older gentleman smiled and gently touched Adrian's shoulder. Some gifts should be accepted with gratitude, he said in Arabic. Jasmine translated the words, although Adrian already understood them. Slowly, he reached out and accepted the paper with both hands. The ballroom lights reflected softly across its faded edges. Adrian unfolded it carefully and looked at the familiar handwriting. For a moment, he could not speak. Jasmine waited quietly beside him, her tea tray resting against her apron. The older gentleman looked at the paper and laughed softly. Adrian finally smiled. This is my grandfather's handwriting, he said. I have not seen it since I was a boy. He looked up at Jasmine. Hassan trusted you with something our family thought was lost forever. Jasmine shook her head gently. He said it never belonged to one family. He believed kindness should travel from one person to another. Adrian folded the paper again and slipped it safely into the inside pocket of his jacket. Then he looked around the ballroom filled with business leaders, guests, and hotel staff. There is something everyone here should know. Jasmine looked surprised. Sir, that is not necessary. Adrian smiled. I think it is. He walked toward the small stage where the evening's welcome speeches had been taking place. The event organizers noticed him and quickly offered the microphone. The room gradually became quiet. Guests looked toward the stage, expecting an announcement about business or charity. Adrian looked across the ballroom until he found Jasmine standing near the back, ready to return to work. Tonight, he began, I arrived expecting to discuss investments and partnerships. Instead, I discovered a lesson that began long before I was born. The room listened in silence. Adrian held up the folded paper. A family friend once shared our traditions with a little girl because he believed that knowledge should never be hidden and kindness should never depend on where someone comes from. Jasmine lowered her eyes, hoping not to become the center of attention. Adrian continued. That little girl grew up to become a young woman who works hard, treats strangers with respect, and carries those lessons without asking for recognition. Several guests turned toward Jasmine. The older couple she had helped earlier smiled proudly. Adrian looked at her and said, Miss Brooks reminded me tonight that culture is not something we protect by keeping it to ourselves. We protect it by sharing it with people who value it. The ballroom filled with warm applause. Jasmine looked embarrassed and quietly shook her head. Adrian laughed. I know you would rather be carrying tea than standing in front of a crowd. Several guests smiled. Jasmine answered with a soft laugh of her own. Adrian looked at the audience once more. My grandfather believed that every language should make people feel welcome. Tonight, one waitress accomplished that better than any business leader in this room. The applause grew even stronger. Jasmine noticed the older gentleman standing with his hand over his heart. He spoke one quiet sentence in Arabic. Adrian listened and smiled. He says Hassan would be very happy tonight. Jasmine felt her eyes fill with tears, but she quickly blinked them away. Adrian stepped down from the stage and walked back toward her. Miss Brooks, he said softly, you returned a piece of my family's history. I would like to return something to you. Jasmine looked confused. Adrian reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver key attached to an old leather tag. This belonged to Hassan's little bookstore and market. My family kept it after he retired because we thought nobody would understand what it meant. I think we were wrong. Adrian held the small silver key in the palm of his hand for a moment before offering it to Jasmine. The old leather tag hanging from it had faded with time, but one word could still be read clearly. Hassan. Jasmine looked at the key and then shook her head with a gentle smile. Sir, I cannot accept that. Adrian looked surprised. Why not? Jasmine glanced around the ballroom. The older gentleman was watching quietly, and many of the guests had paused their conversations to see what would happen next. Because it belongs to your family's story. Adrian smiled softly. I thought that too for many years. Tonight, I learned something different. He looked down at the key. My grandfather trusted Hassan. Hassan trusted you. If stories are meant to travel, then perhaps this key has already found its home. Jasmine folded her hands over her apron. Hassan taught me that gratitude means taking care of a gift, not owning it. The older gentleman laughed warmly and spoke in Arabic. Adrian smiled as he translated. He says both of you sound exactly like Hassan. The three of them laughed together. Adrian looked at the key one more time before placing it gently back into Jasmine's hand. Then promise me something. Jasmine looked at him. What is that? Adrian pointed toward the old leather tag. Keep telling the stories. Teach the language. Welcome strangers. Let the kindness continue. Jasmine closed her fingers around the key and nodded. I can promise that. The ballroom filled with applause as the evening's final announcement was made. Guests began gathering their coats and saying goodbye to old friends. The elderly couple Jasmine had helped earlier walked over to thank her one last time. The older woman spoke in Arabic, and Jasmine answered with a smile. Adrian watched the exchange quietly. The older gentleman standing beside him looked pleased. Do you know what I think? He asked Adrian. Adrian smiled. Tell me. The older man looked toward Jasmine. I think your grandfather would have called this a successful business meeting. Adrian laughed. Why? The old man smiled. Because everyone leaves richer than they arrived. Adrian stood quietly for a moment before walking over to Jasmine one last time. Miss Brooks. Jasmine looked up. Yes, sir. Adrian reached into his jacket pocket and removed the folded paper she had returned to him. He carefully made a copy of the blessing with a pen from the registration desk and handed the original back to her. Jasmine looked confused. I thought this belonged to your family. Adrian shook his head. The paper does. The lesson belongs to everyone. Jasmine looked down and read the familiar words once again. May the doors you open for others become the path that guides you home. She smiled and carefully placed the blessing beside the silver key. The older gentleman placed his hand over his heart and quietly repeated the words in Arabic. Adrian joined him. Jasmine listened and answered in the same language. 3 different lives had somehow become part of the same story. As the last guests left the ballroom, Jasmine picked up her tea tray and prepared to finish her shift. Adrian walked toward the hotel entrance before stopping one final time. Miss Brooks. Jasmine turned around. Adrian smiled. Tonight, I walked into this room believing success was measured by the deals we make. Jasmine waited quietly. Adrian looked at the silver key in her hand, and then at the guests she had helped throughout the evening. You reminded me that the greatest fortunes are the kindness we pass from one person to another. Jasmine smiled warmly. That was Hassan's favorite lesson too. Adrian nodded and stepped into the night. Jasmine watched him leave before returning to her work. Her grandmother had always said that some people arrive in your life carrying money, and some arrive carrying wisdom. The lucky ones discover that the second gift is worth far more than the first, and somewhere beyond the city lights. It felt as though an old bookseller was smiling because a simple promise had finally found its way home.